You know Florida as beaches and oranges, theme park skylines and alligator-sunned canals. You picture tourists in flip-flops and the restless hum of traffic on the causeway. But beneath the palm trees and the strip malls, beneath the modern maps and municipal boundaries, there are places where time has folded like an old map, where peat and shell and limestone keep secrets that refuse to fit the neat categories modern science likes to draw. Imagine standing at the edge of a black, mirror-still pond at dawn, fog clinging to the cypress knees like a veil. Imagine the whisper of milling birds and nothing else. In the mud below your feet, for thousands of years, people were being laid to rest in ways that confound the tidy story of how North America's ancient peoples lived and moved. That contrast, that ordinary front-page Florida against the extraordinary persistence of the very old, is where our story begins, and where the invitation for you starts, to look again, to listen closer, and to let the strange questions linger. We promise you 3 things: vivid places, real, mapped, and oddly intimate when you read their names, hard facts, radii and radiocarbon dates, artifact types, trade routes hinted at by copper and shell, and the unsatisfied hush at the end of each tale where speculation and mystery still live. This will not be a parade of triumphalist answers. It will be a slow, cinematic tour through puzzles, where every firm assertion carries its counterweight. A neat archaeological date balanced by a rumor about giants, a dendrochronology balanced by a local legend, a careful phosphate analysis balanced by a voice that insists something more mythical once walked those shores. I'll speak to you directly, because the best documentaries are not lectures but invitations. We'll walk the foggy trail at dawn together, picture ourselves tracing post holes cut into bedrock beneath a modern downtown street, imagine the hands that carved a wooden effigy in a salty pond, and learn why scientists still scratch their heads. You'll hear names like Windover and Key Marco and the Miami Circle, and you'll come away with the sense that Florida is not an odd place for ancient mysteries. It's one of the best places in North America to find them. Part of what makes these sites so compelling is scale. Some are intimate, small, precisely made objects carved from wood or bone, while others are grand, landscape-altering earthworks that orient a community's life for centuries. The timeline is sprawling. We will cross millennia, from the Middle Archaic burials of more than 7,000 years ago to complex, highly organized mound centers where plazas and monumental stones recall long-distance ties. We will meet artifacts that speak of trade networks stretching toward the Ohio Valley and into the Caribbean, and at the same time we will confront peat-preserved human tissues and wooden carvings that force us to revise assumptions about material preservation in the humid Southeast. And at each turn, we will listen to multiple voices: the cautious voice of peer-reviewed archaeology, the speculative voice that wants to fill gaps with giants and lost tribes, and the local voices that bring ritual and human grief into the story. Still, for all the evidence, each place keeps its question mark. This is not a catalog of curiosities designed for lurid clicks. It is a cinematic excavation, layers of detail piled like strata, each paragraph a camera dolly, each sentence a beam of light into the dark. You will be offered the data you need: dates, measurements, the names of cultures, a sense of how many people pass through a place, and you will be asked to hold that data alongside the more mythic possibilities. Keep your skepticism, keep your wonder. When we reach the end of this first pass, you'll understand not just the strange facts themselves but why they matter, because each mystery is, in the end, a mirror held up to the human habit of making meaning from the world. The unfinishedness is part of the point. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet. Our first stop is one of the most astonishingly intimate, a shallow pond where peat preserved human remains and the fragile artifacts that would normally rot away in Florida's hot, humid soils. Here, the dead are not buried beneath a dry mound but carefully laid into the muck, where the chemistry of the pond arrested decomposition and held whole people in suspended time. The pond's name is Windover, and its story is a study in how a single find can split familiar accounts of the past open like a seed pod. Windover is a modest place on the map, near present-day Titusville, on the Atlantic coast of central Florida, but its archaeological value is enormous. Excavations revealed the skeletons of well over 100 individuals, men and women and children, arranged in shallow graves beneath peat. Radiocarbon dating places the burials roughly in the Middle Archaic period, broadly in the range of roughly 8,000 to 5,000 years before present, with some work suggesting concentrated activity around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago. That's a timeline so deep it predates pottery in the region and complicates any simple tale of cultural advancement, moving steadily east to west or north to south. These were not ephemeral camps. People returned to this pond for generations, and they did so in a way that suggests complex social rituals surrounding death. The sheer number of well-preserved individuals, scores of complete skeletons and, in some cases, preserved brain tissue, turned Windover into a uniquely rich window into early life in eastern North America. What makes Windover so perplexing, in cinematic terms, is the collision between profound scientific evidence and the questions that evidence raises. First, there is the painstaking detail: textile fragments, woven materials, and botanical remains found with the bodies suggest sophisticated fiber technologies at a very early date, people who could weave and wrap. Then there are the cranial remains. Some skulls yield isotopic evidence of diet, others hint at genetic affinities that complicate tidy migration models. The older models of simple, linear movement into North America are fraying at Windover's edges. Here we see a community that seems stable for centuries, with mortuary practices so consistent they must have been embedded in their social fabric. Now, let's be fair, every excavation has its limits. A muck pond preserves things we rarely see, but it also invites interpretive pitfalls. How representative is a mortuary pond of everyday life? Why were bodies placed in water? Was it ritual, convenience, a response to rising water tables, or some set of beliefs about the boundary between life and death? Scholars have proposed several competing theories. One idea is straightforward funerary practice. These were deliberate, ritualized burials in a place considered sacred. Another posits that the dead were placed into the pond as a form of excarnation or a belief about returning to watery origins. The local environment may have had cosmological associations we no longer grasp. There are biological theories, too, that the peat's chemistry favored preservation, and that similar sites might exist but be invisible because they lie under peat or shallow water. So Windover might be a survivor of a class of mortuary places now largely lost to time. But here's where it gets tricky. The intentionality behind water burial and the specific social rules governing who was placed here and how they were arranged remain stubbornly opaque. We still don't know why this community chose the pond as a resting place for the dead rather than a dry burial in a mound or a shell midden. And because the preservation is so good, mythic elements begin to seep in, not as evidence, but as evocative shadows we must acknowledge. In some retellings, the idea of people being buried in a black pond conjures ghost stories, giant skeletons emerging from the peat in local folklore, or whispered tales of strange wooden idols preserved in the muck. Archaeology must resist romantic embellishment, but the folkloric response to Windover tells us something important. When people encounter deep time in a familiar landscape, they translate it into story. The scientific record and the popular narrative braid together here, and both are worth listening to. Picture yourself kneeling at the pond's edge at dawn, mist lifts in slow ribbons, a heron stands like a sentinel, and below the surface lies a community's slow, deliberate memory. You can almost feel the care in each burial, the textile folds, the little personal items that once mattered to the living. That intimacy is humbling and disquieting. Windover also complicates models of social complexity. The presence of diverse artifacts, bone tools, evidence of weaving, and floral remains that hint at medicinal knowledge, suggests a community with division of labor and specialized skills. Yet these people left no monumental architecture here. Their social life may have been expressed differently than the plaza and mound complexes you see elsewhere in the southeast. That forces archaeologists to reevaluate what complexity looks like, not only in grand forms like temple mounds and earthen pyramids, but in long-lived mortuary traditions and sophisticated craftwork that leaves little trace except under exceptional preservation conditions. Still, for all the evidence of craft and continuity, the larger questions remain. How did Windover's people relate to neighboring groups? Were they the roots of later mound-building societies or a distinct branch that faded? Again, the archaeologist's voice must be cautious. Multiple competing explanations exist, and each fits parts of the data while leaving other parts unexplained. Another layer of the mystery is genetic. Modern techniques applied to ancient DNA from peat-preserved remains can suggest relationships within and between populations, hints about migration, intermarriage, and long-distance contact. Early results from similar coastal sites sometimes suggest affiliations that crisscross large regions, raising the possibility that Windover's people participated in networks we cannot fully reconstruct yet. If copper from the Ohio or tropical shells from the Caribbean show up in the archaeological record at other Florida sites, we begin to see not isolated pockets but threads of a larger tapestry. Yet here's the rub: DNA and isotopic signals can be noisy. They offer probabilities, not certainties. The more we learn, the more questions multiply. Were these networks based on marriage ties, trade partnerships, pilgrimage, or seasonal congregation for ritual? We still don't know. The pond itself becomes a stage for larger debates about environmental change. Florida's coastline has shifted enormously since the Archaic. Sea level rise, shifts in estuaries, and the migration of fresh and saltwater ecologies would have altered where people lived and where they buried their dead. Some researchers argue that mortuary ponds like Windover reflect a stable, water-rich environment that encouraged certain practices. Others say rising seas might have forced relocations, creating discontinuities in the record. That means Windover is not just a window into ritual, it's a climate record, too. Imagine then a scene: families walking across low, marshy ground toward the pond, the horizon indistinct where water meets land, children at their heels. One era's shoreline becomes another era's inland marsh, and people adapt in ways both practical and spiritual. That image helps us remember why human stories are always ecological stories. People responded to the land as it changed, and the land recorded those responses in peat, shell, and bone. There are sensational spins on Windover. Of course there are. In popular retellings, the image of well-preserved ancient bodies naturally invites talk of giants or anomalous skulls. Some fringe narratives exclaim over supposed giant skeletons found in Florida's past, a modern echo of older mythic preoccupations. From a professional standpoint, those claims rarely hold up to scrutiny. Measurements, context, and peer-reviewed publication are the arbiters. Yet the fact that such narratives persist is telling. They reveal our hunger for larger-than-life explanations when confronted with the magnitude of human time. It's an emotional reflex worth acknowledging, not because the evidence supports giants, but because the impulse to mythologize says something true about how humans reckon with unfathomable pasts. At Windover there is also an intimate horror and tenderness to the finds. Some infants were buried with little shells, others with plant-based wrappings, and a few graves preserve what may be personal adornments. These are human lives reduced to archaeological data, yet the preservation returns them with an intimacy that is rare: hair, fibers, and in some cases soft tissue traces that allow forensic-level reconstructions of diet and disease. You can't look at such detail and remain emotionally untouched. The scientific work becomes, paradoxically, an act of care across millennia, an attempt to hold what once mattered to these people and to speak for them, not over them. So what does Windover leave us with, finally? It leaves us with the fact of extraordinary preservation and the humility that comes with it. It leaves us with threads we can pull at, questions about ritual, diet, social organization, and connection to broader networks, and with methods that promise more clarity as ancient DNA, isotopic, and textile analyses deepen. But it also leaves us with an abiding silence, the precise beliefs that shaped water burial, the exact reasons for choosing this black pond as a cemetery, the names and songs of the people whose bones lie below the peat. We have radiocarbon dates and woven fibers. We have hypotheses and models. Still, for all the evidence, we still don't know the full story. Picture yourself again at the pond, the surface like a black mirror, with the recorded past glinting under a skin of peat, offering facts and refusing, stubbornly, to offer meaning. That dragging sense of unfinishedness, that mix of awe and restraint, is the truest gift Windover gives us. It teaches an attitude, to hold wonder and doubt together, to let the data shine while embracing the silence in between. If Windover is an intimate portrait, Our next sites will show different faces of ancient Florida: shell-built palaces, carved wooden idols, circles cut into bedrock in what is now downtown Miami, monumental choices that assert human presence on the landscape in louder, more public ways. But every one of them, like Windover, resists simple endings. They will ask you to imagine boats at dusk, plazas filled with chanting, and craftsmen carving figures with tools that leave microscopic marks still legible to specialists. They will tempt us with myths, lost cities, giants, vanished tribes, but they will always bring us back to the archaeological evidence. For now, let the Windover Pond sit in your mind as a place where the dead were not hidden but preserved, a place where we can hear the near voice of people who lived on Florida's ancient margins, and where we must learn to live with the questions their choices leave behind. The next place I want you to step into is a shallow, brackish pond on Marco Island where the air tastes faintly of salt and rot, where, more than a century ago, an excavation pulled more than 1,000 wooden objects out of the muck and turned what people thought they knew about prehistoric art in the southeast upside down. Key Marco, as the site is called, is almost cinematic in its contradictions, a swampy, unremarkable landscape that yielded some of the most delicate and sophisticated wooden carvings ever found in North America: masks, effigies, bowls, netting, and the famous Key Marco cat, a 6-inch carved feline so finely rendered that even modern eyes read it as art rather than mere toolwork. The one-sentence tease is simple. A muddy lagoon on Marco Island became a cathedral of lost wooden art, whose elegance and preservation are still hard to place in any tidy cultural timeline. That single discovery, conducted in the 1890s by Frank Hamilton Cushing, recovered an astonishing assemblage of more than 1,000 waterlogged objects, the largest such cache in the eastern United States, and many of those objects now form a cornerstone for arguments about regional complexity and aesthetic achievement. Let me give you the scene in time and scale. The excavation at Key Marco took place in 1896 to 1897 during the Pepperhurst expedition led by Cushing, and the artifacts pulled from the anaerobic muck were remarkably intact because oxygen had been excluded from the deposit. Wood, fiber, and paint that would normally have rotted away remained. Those objects are often placed broadly in the late prehistoric sequence of southwest Florida, a world that, by European contact in the early 1500s, was dominated by the Calusa polity, a complex maritime chiefdom whose reach and social organization perplexed early explorers. Some researchers have argued that many of the Key Marco objects belong to the cultural ancestors of the Calusa or to closely related local traditions, perhaps spanning somewhere in the last 2 millennia, though precise calibrated radiocarbon ranges for every object are complicated by early excavation methods and the difficulties of dating waterlogged wood recovered before modern conservation techniques. What is certain is that Cushing's finds gave archaeologists direct evidence that people on Florida's southwestern shores had developed a rich visual language in wood, a medium rarely preserved elsewhere, and that their artistry and material culture were both local and, in some ways, cosmopolitan. Now, let's be fair. Key Marco's discovery is bound up with the history of archaeology itself. Cushing was a brilliant and controversial figure, an early ethnographer who sometimes blurred lines between excavation and showmanship, and his methods were not those of 21st century fieldwork. That matters because early excavation records were incomplete and conservation of those waterlogged objects was a technological challenge at the time. Some artifacts disintegrated upon exposure to air, while others survived and entered museum collections. The record we have is therefore both a treasure and a puzzle: treasure because of the richness of the finds, puzzle because of gaps in documentation and the loss of context for some items. Still, the material that did survive, masks with painted pigments, intricately carved figureheads, bundles of netting and cordage, speaks to a society with skilled woodworkers, complex ritual visuality, and probably specialized craft roles. Picture a shoreline workshop at dusk, a carver shaping a figurehead for a canoe, men and women twisting cordage for nets beneath a simple awning, children running along shell-littered sand while the tide draws in and out. That intimacy is the kind of human detail dry sites rarely yield. Key Marco also forces us to confront the region's trade and political networks. Southwest Florida sits at a crossroads of maritime routes, waters that connect the Gulf, the 10,000 islands, the Everglades, and even the wider Caribbean. Some of the motifs in Key Marco carvings echo iconography seen elsewhere in the southeast and beyond: zoomorphic figures, elaborate face masks, and decorative inlays that hint at shared symbolic systems. Were these motifs evidence of long-distance trade, shared ritual repertoires, traveling artisans, or convergent local evolution of styles? Scholars have suggested a variety of models. One argument frames Key Marco as an expression of a socially stratified coast where elites commissioned ornate carved objects for ritual use and display, which would align with accounts of the Calusa as a hierarchical, territorially organized polity when the Spanish arrived. Another suggests that the objects represent a localized artisan tradition, a high level of craftsmanship produced by small communities whose output was not necessarily the sign of top-down elite patronage, but of deeply embedded local aesthetic values. But here's where it gets tricky. The broader archaeological context for Key Marco is less well preserved than for some mound centers, and because many objects were removed without fine-grained contextual notes, it's hard to distinguish clearly between elite ritual caches and everyday toolkit items that happen to be exquisitely made. We still don't know the exact social function of many of these objects. Were they sacred paraphernalia hidden away, trade goods, or common artisan products whose survival simply skewed our perception? The preservation itself invites mythic thinking. Wood carved centuries ago, dipped into anaerobic layers and pulled back again by a young science, seems to demand a story with grandeur, that a lost, highly artistic people once dominated the mangrove isles, that they carved effigies of spirits and animals, and that those effigies were secreted away to avoid some cataclysm. Fringe narratives, as with other dramatic finds, have sometimes layered giants, or lost civilizations, onto these facts. But the professional voice pushes back. We have no reliable evidence of monolithic stone monuments at Key Marco, no inscriptional scripts, and the best reading is of a maritime living people with exceptional craftsmanship. That said, mythic elements persist for a psychological reason. When fragile beauty survives against the odds, we human beings reach for tales that are commensurate with our awe. Picture yourself on the edge of that pond at twilight, the wooden deer head lifted like an offering, paint faded but the carved eye still purposeful. What would you imagine about the craftsman's intentions? That imaginative exercise is valuable even if it does not substitute for evidence. Key Marco's artifacts also force us to rethink technology and economy. Netting and cordage imply sophisticated fishing economies. Carved canoe parts and figureheads suggest seafaring capacity. Carved masks and small statuettes indicate ritual display and perhaps shamanic practice. Some argue that the region's abundance, fish, shell, and an array of plant and animal resources, allowed populations to concentrate and specialize without the grain agriculture commonly associated with complex societies. That challenges standard evolutionary models in archaeology that predict complexity arises only with intensive cereal farming. Instead, Key Marco suggests an alternate pathway: maritime abundance enabling social differentiation, craft specialization, and the creation of elaborate ritual objects. Yet, of course, this interpretation raises questions about population density, seasonal mobility, and labor organization. How did these communities sustain artisans? Were the carvers full-time specialists or seasonal craftsmen? There are plausible models for both, but the artifact record alone, especially one processed a century ago, leaves us bracketed by possibilities rather than certainties. Another thread worth pulling is artistic transmission. The motifs on Key Marco objects have been compared to iconographies in the lower Mississippi and Ohio Valley regions and to Caribbean objects, suggesting a flow of ideas, or at least convergent symbolic language, across large distances. How did such visual languages travel? One route is direct maritime contact. Canoes and coastal voyaging could have ferried ideas and objects up and down the shore. Another is through inland waterways that connected coasts with riverine networks. A third is through ritual pilgrimage or exchange networks where objects and motifs circulated as prestige items. Still, for all the morphological similarities that researchers can plot, pinning down direct pathways of influence is hard. Did a motif originate in one core area and diffuse, or did separate regions independently develop similar expressive forms because of shared ecological logics and animal motifs? Again, archaeological evidence supports multiple readings but does not deliver a single resolution. We still don't know the precise channels that carried artistic ideas to and from Key Marco. The human stories embedded in those wooden objects are affecting. The Key Marco cat itself, only a few inches tall, retains details of musculature and posture that suggest not only an eye for naturalism but perhaps a spiritual relationship to particular animals. Could such a small figurine have been a talisman, an emblem for a family lineage, a deity's representation, or a child's toy? The material does not always speak in single-purpose sentences. That ambiguity is the point. Objects are polysemous. They mean different things in different contexts. Imagine holding that carved cat in your hand, the wood's grain, the traces of pigment, the smoothness from centuries of handling. Each physical trace is a whisper from the past, but the whisper's language is incomplete. That incompleteness is not failure. It is an invitation to imagine responsibly, to craft stories tethered to the data we have, and to leave room for the many lives those objects once crossed. There's also political history folded into the artifact's modern journeys. Many Key Marco objects left Florida for distant institutions in the early 20th century. Only recently have efforts been made to bring some of them back for display on Marco Island, often on long-term loan from national museums. That movement raises ethical questions about stewardship, community connection, and who gets to tell the story of past peoples. Museums argue that conservation and research capacities sometimes required centralized collections, while local advocates emphasize the cultural value of having artifacts near their find spots. This tension is part of a broader reckoning across archaeology and museology about repatriation, local engagement, and the responsibilities of researchers to descendant communities. It's a present-day mystery of its own, how to balance care for fragile objects with respect for place and people. Picture an exhibit where the cat sits behind glass, but the tides still lap the shore where its ancestors once stood. How should that proximity shape interpretation and access? The ethical question adds a modern, human dimension to the ancient material one. Finally, there are the sensational counterclaims that gather like storm clouds around any spectacular find. Key Marco's beauty has attracted fringe theories, wild claims about pre-Columbian maritime empires or exotic visitors, that lack the weight of archaeological method. Professional archaeology resists such extrapolations, but the persistence of sensational claims reveals an underlying truth about how people engage with mystery. Extraordinary artifacts invite extraordinary stories. The correct archaeological response is to hold the wonder and the method together, to let the carved feline's gaze impress you while insisting on methodical dating, careful contextualization, and cautious interpretation. We still don't know the full range of meanings these objects held for their makers, nor can we fully reconstruct the daily rhythms of the workshops and temples that produced them. But we do know that Key Marco's wooden art expands our imagination of prehistoric Florida. Its people were not mere survivors eking out existence. They were skilled artists and maritime specialists living in a world of rich symbolism and complex social life. So when you walk the modern boardwalks of Marco Island and look out over tidal flats that have been reshaped by centuries of storms and development, remember that beneath the mud once lay a teeming artistic world. Picture again the carvers, hands stained with pigment, working in the flicker of a hearth, the sound of oars in the channel beyond, and the occasional hiss of mangrove leaves. Picture that tiny cat, its carved haunches poised, an emblem of a people whose artistry the ocean briefly saved and modernity nearly lost. Hold your skepticism and your wonder together. Keep the Key Marco cat in your imagination as both an art object and an archaeological lesson, evidence so fragile it must be handled with science and respect. We still don't know the full story of who made these pieces, exactly when each one was carved, or the full social and ritual life those objects once animated. We'll leave the salt and peat behind for a moment and move upriver, to a different kind of monument, a shell-built city that reworks the landscape itself into platforms and plazas, a place where stones are absent but human ambition is written in shell mounds large enough to reshape the shoreline and control water and people. But before we go, let the Key Marco pond sit in your imagination as an instance where preservation turned a marsh into a gallery, and where the mysteries of artistry and social life remain as porous and deep as the muck that kept them. Walk with me now to a river bend where the oyster shells have become stone over centuries, not because the sea turned them to rock, but because human hands piled them so deliberately, and in such quantity, that the shoreline itself was remade to hold meaning. This is Crystal River, a place where shell and sand were not merely refuse but the raw material of a temple, a palace, and a cemetery all at once. Say the name, and you might picture a sleepy Gulf Coast town and manatees bobbing in clear springs. Say the name to an archaeologist, and you hear a long, layered timeline, a ceremonial complex that was used, returned to, and transformed for more than a millennium. The short, cinematic tease is this: on a crescent of Florida's Big Bend coast, people piled shells and sand into monumental mounds, created a broad artifact sterile plaza, and drew visitors from far-off places to bury their dead and perform rituals. Yet why this place became a magnet, and why it was abandoned, remains a tangle of dates, ecology, and human choice. Radiocarbon dates and stratigraphic evidence show repeated use from deep in the woodland period through later pre-contact times. The site's long occupation makes Crystal River one of the most sustained ceremonial centers in the southeastern United States. Picture the scale: an arc of middens stretching over 1,000 feet, shell deposits piled 7 feet deep in places, and on one knoll a flattened temple mound you can climb. 50-plus steps take you to a wooden viewing platform, because the mound itself rises nearly 30 feet above the marsh, a raised knuckle of human labor in a low-lying world. The main shell midden at its largest reaches well over 1,000 feet in length and 100 feet across in places. Another mound complex on nearby Roberts Island picks up the ceremonial baton later in the sequence. These are not ephemeral piles but landscape sculpture, controlled, purposeful accumulations of food refuse, sacred earth, and intentional fill that together create a stage for public ritual. One careful survey measured the temple mound's top at roughly 40 by 60 feet in older descriptions, and recent laserscan work gives precise plan and profile figures for Mound A in metric detail, evidence of a built and rebuilt place. Now, let's be fair, Crystal River does two things at once, and that complicates interpretation. On the one hand, middens record daily life: oyster shells, fish bones, broken tools, pottery sherds, things that tell you how people ate and worked. On the other hand, the platform mounds and the concentric embankments and the artifact sterile plaza speak of ceremony and planning on a different scale. How do those two scales, substance and spectacle, fit together in one place? The dominant reading is that Crystal River served as a regional ceremonial center. People came, perhaps seasonally or annually, to participate in feasts and burials, exchanging goods and ideas in ways that tied disparate communities into larger social webs. Some researchers estimate thousands of visits in a busy year, a generosity of movement that turns the site into something like a pre-Columbian pilgrimage hub on the Gulf Coast. At the same time, long-term terrace building and repeated deposition show that a local population maintained presence here for centuries, investing labor into mounds and plazas that required coordination and leadership. That ambiguous coexistence, local permanence, and regional magnetism, is the first puzzle. Was Crystal River primarily a home base that doubled as a regional ceremonial ground, or was it primarily a stage to which many came while few remained? Different datasets push toward different answers. Then there are the dates, the slow beads on a long string that resist tidy periodization. Radiocarbon and ceramic evidence placed the site's earliest layers into the formative centuries of the first millennium BC, and its use continuing, in various phases, into the first millennium C and beyond. Some analyses lay concentrated ceremonial activity roughly between 500 BC and the early 2nd millennium CE, with a particularly fecund woodland period presence that scholars often associate with regional expressions like Weedon Island and related cultural phases. Over time, burial practices at Crystal River change. Early graves sometimes include exotic grave goods, copper ornaments, and worked items that betray connections far to the north, while later burials are more plain. That shifting inventory tells us that the social and economic networks that fed into Crystal River were themselves in flux. Sometimes the site occupied the center of a long-distance trade network, and sometimes those lines of connection dimmed. The fact that copper, material more commonly associated with the Ohio Valley's Hopewellian circuit, turns up in early burials is a sign of wide-ranging contact. Shells and other local resources reveal a coastal economy sophisticated enough to anchor ritual prestige. But here's where it gets tricky. What exactly were those Hopewell connections? Archaeologists have argued for indirect trade, objects or raw materials moving down rivers and coastlines via many hands rather than through a single, hegemonic exchange corridor. Copper awls and ornaments at Crystal River suggest items prized enough to be carried long distances as prestige goods, but that does not necessarily mean the Gulf coasters were politically controlled from the Ohio. Rather, prestige might have flowed outward along networks of reciprocal exchange and ritual alliance. Some think the graves with copper represent a temporal window when the site's regional prestige peaked. Others suggest that the presence of northern goods reflects active long-distance alliances or marriage ties that brought exotic items south for burial display. None of these interpretations is mutually exclusive, and each changes how we imagine the people on the plaza. Were they local elites displaying northern rarities to cement status? Or were they visiting pilgrims receiving prestige items as ritual gifts? We still don't know the precise social choreography behind those shiny copper pieces. Another thorny issue is the circular embankment and the artifact sterile plaza, an area archaeologists describe as largely devoid of the usual discard of daily life. That absence is itself a presence, a deliberate clearing where something significant happened repeatedly, and where the archaeology shows careful construction sequences. Platforms and ramps suggest that people staged activity on leveled tops, perhaps residences of ritual specialists, temples, or places where leaders performed for gathered crowds. One reading treats the plaza as ceremonial stadium, large, managed gatherings with feasting and performance. An alternative reads the same space as ritualized cemetery architecture. The sterile zone is maintained to separate the living from the dead, a sacred core where only certain categories of objects were allowed. Another model emphasizes environmental management, raising habitations above flood-prone ground and controlling movement across a marshy landscape. Again, different kinds of evidence push us in other directions: the patterning of burials, the size of the mounds, and ethnographic analogy each implied different functions. Picture the plaza filled with smoke and song, people moving in processional arcs, trays of steaming oysters carried past a line of carved posts. Or picture the same plaza emptied save for mourners and the quietly wrapped bodies of the dead. Both are plausible scenes, and both dwell side by side in the data. Environmental change is another actor in this drama, and it casts long, ambiguous shadows. Florida's coast has been in slow, relentless flux. Sea level oscillations, estuarine shifts, and the ebb and flow of freshwater springs all reshape the resources on which coastal societies relied. Some paleoecological work at Crystal River shows changing vegetation histories and suggests that oyster beds and fish stocks the site depended on could have been variable over centuries. One tempting theory for the site's decline around the first millennium's end is ecological stress. Overharvesting, disease, or shifting estuaries might have reduced the site's utility as a communal feasting ground. Another possibility is socio-political: the rise of competing centers, regional reorganization, or changing ritual circuits could have made Crystal River less central. Climate and culture act together here. Disentangling them is difficult, because a drop in oyster yields might be both cause and consequence of social change. Still, for all the ecological data, the reasons people left, or stopped coming, are not pinned down. We still don't know whether the plaza fell silent because the sea changed, the people changed, or a mix of the two. No archaeological story is complete without the human detail, and Crystal River offers scenes that tug at the heart. Some burials, careful interments placed between shell layers, contain ornaments and pottery that suggest status. Others are simple, perhaps children or people buried in less elaborate fashion. Imagine a funeral procession, women carrying bundles of shells, elders chanting names that have now vanished, drums beating a low rhythm as a body is carried to the mound and placed with a copper pin or a carved bowl. The act of laying someone to rest here was not merely disposal, it was a public statement within a network of memory. And because the mounds are open to the landscape, rising above marsh and river, the view from their summits would have been as much political as spiritual. A leader looking over gathering crowds and tidal flats, the sea glittering like a theater of resources below. That visual of people using the ridge, both practical and symbolic, helps us remember why mounds matter. They are material speech, loud as any carved monument. Yet despite all the graves and their goods, the precise meanings, the prayers said, the names used, the stories told, remain beyond the archaeologist's reach. We still don't know the words that accompanied those burials. Of course, myth presses against the facts with its own force. Some popular narratives have longed for more exotic explanations, that the stele-like carved stones at Crystal River show Mesoamerican contact, that the scale of the mounds implies a lost city-state, or that mysterious stele betray direct links to ancient Central American empires. Scholars have rightly pushed back. While the stele-like limestone slab at the site is unusual in regional context and invites comparison with distant monumental traditions, most experts favor careful models of selective borrowing and indirect influence rather than direct colonization. That said, the slab's presence is worth taking seriously. It suggests that Crystal River's people were actors in a world of ideas, open to symbolic forms that may have traveled long distances. The mythic impulse, to fill the silence with grand contact stories, tells us about our hunger for narrative closure, but it must bow to measured interpretation. Still, that stele is a striking, nearly cinematic object. Imagine a stone face watching the river, weathered but purposeful, as if the mound complex had its own guardian carved in limestone. The image is compelling because it is rare. The cultural significance of that slab, like so much here, remains an open question. Finally, there is the modern dimension. Crystal River's archaeological story is also a story about stewardship, tourism, and memory. The site is a protected state park and a National Historic Landmark. Visitors climb Temple Mound, read interpretive panels, and walk a trail that traces ancient shorelines. Yet the site's preservation depends on choices about what to display, how to interpret contested histories, and how to involve descendant communities in telling the story. The mounds are both scientific resources and sacred landscapes, and managing those dual identities requires sensitivity. Imagine standing on the Tower Mound's platform at sunset. Kayaks drift on the river, a tourist pamphlet flaps in the wind, and below, in the layers of shell and sand, people who mattered gather still in the eyes of those who come to look. That present-day choreography folds into the ancient one. Both are acts of remembrance, and both ask us to be careful in how we look. So what does Crystal River leave us with, in the end? It leaves a cathedral of shells and sand, mounds that once organized bodies, power, and ritual, plazas that were deliberately cleared of the ordinary, and a record of long-distance contact in copper and ceremonial goods. It teaches us that monumentality in the ancient Southeast did not always take the form of stone temples. It could be shell ramps and plated plazas, quietly monumental in their endurance. It also teaches humility. The datasets are rich but partial. The dates suggest long usage but not precise social scripts, the objects hint at networks but do not narrate their politics. We can walk its trails and climb its mounds and feel the force of human design. We can read the radiocarbon dates and the ceramic typologies and sketch models of social organization. But when we ask the deepest questions, why these people came here repeatedly, what words they spoke at burials, which gestures mark them as kin or foe, the past slips to silence. We still don't know. Picture yourself at the top of Temple Mound as gulls cut across the late light. You see the river braided with channels, the marsh catching the sky, and you sense, as people once did, that this is a place shaped by hands and meaning. Hold that sense of wonder and that ache of not knowing together. It is where archaeology does its best work, illuminating and interrogating, opening doors and then waiting respectfully at the threshold. We step now to the bedrock circle cut into the very underbelly of a modern city, the Miami Circle, where the ancient and the cosmopolitan meet in an arresting silhouette, stones pecked into the limestone bedrock in a near-perfect circular plan, right where glass towers now scrape the sky. The Quick Tease, in downtown Miami, a prehistoric ring cut into bedrock marks a built structure, unique in North America, and its origins and meaning are still argued over. When workers uncovered the circle in 1998, archaeologists found post holes carved directly into the bedrock and burn features that, when dated, placed human construction here roughly 2,000 years ago. tying the site to the Tequesta people who inhabited southeastern Florida when Europeans first arrived. The bedrock circle is extraordinary partly because it is literally the footprint of a structure, the only known prehistoric architectural plan cut into bedrock on the North American Atlantic coast, forcing us to imagine a built and intentional place beneath downtown streets where skyscrapers now demand attention. What makes the Miami Circle slippery is how tightly it presses ancient human design into the modern cityscape. A ring about 38 feet, roughly 12 meters, across, with a pattern of cut holes and burned surfaces that imply a circular house or ceremonial structure anchored to the rock. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal and burnt wood places the construction in a window spanning roughly between 2,000 and 1,700 years ago, an age that makes the circle contemporary with other woodland and late archaic traditions elsewhere in the southeast. The material traces, charred posts, tool marks on bedrock, and an absence of the kinds of deep midden accumulations archaeologists expect, suggest a plaza-like or house-like feature whose significance was not the accumulation of refuse but the production of communal ritual or daily continuity. Now, let's be fair, the circle's interpretation has been fought over in public and political arenas as much as in academic journals. The presence of a rare archaeological feature beneath prime real estate invited legal battles over preservation and development, and the voices of descendant communities add a moral immediacy to those debates. That modern friction is part of the site's story. Archaeology here cannot be abstract. It is entangled with civic decisions about who gets to decide a city's past and future. From the burned post holes we can spin compelling images. Imagine at twilight a circular house or council lodge with fires at the center, people gathered beneath a thatched cone, hammered posts ringing the ring like ribs of a planetarium. Processions might have spiraled into the circle for births, deaths, or seasonal ceremonies that anchored community identity to the river mouth and to the sea beyond. Yet technical questions remain. Was the circle used continuously or episodically? Was it a domestic ring for a large group, the seat of a ritual leader, or the footprint of a structure built for an event that happened only rarely? Each reading is plausible and each reshapes how we imagine the ancient Miami River landscape, an open lagoon threaded by canoes and watched from a ringed, rock-anchored hall. Still, for all the evidence and civic theater, we still don't know the precise social choreography that took place within that ring, or the full ritual grammar that would have made its post holes meaningful. Picture yourself descending from the glass towers to stand on the preserved slab and feeling the bedrock's grooves underfoot. You will feel both awe and a palpable absence of the spoken words that once filled the space. We move south and west now to an island that is at once a midden and a metropolis, Mound Key, where the Calusa remade Estero Bay into a palatial capital. The one-line hook, Mound Key is a human-made island of shell and sand that functioned as the ceremonial and political heart of the Calusa Kingdom, a coastal chiefdom whose power baffled early European observers. Archaeological and historical records, including early Spanish accounts, place Mound Key at the center of a Calusa polity active in the centuries before and after European contact. Radiocarbon dates and midden stratigraphy extend the site's origins back well over 1,000 years, with some analyses pushing cultural occupation back 2 millennia. The island's monumental shell mounds, canals, and plazas are not the byproduct of random discard. They are an engineered landscape where middens became foundations and ritual spaces. That engineered landscape suggests a polity that organized labor on scales large enough to create an island of ritual and habitation, and the island's strategic position in Estero Bay made it a hub for maritime control and symbolic display. Think of Mound Key not as a ruin but as a stage. Plazas where audiences gathered, raised ramps that guided visitors to ceremonial houses, canals carved for canoe traffic that threaded power across mangrove-lined waterways. Spanish chronicles from the 16th century describe rulers of the Calusa as commanding and highly ritualized, with rulers framed as almost divine, an impression that resonates with the physical evidence of concentrated labor at Mound Key. Yet, let's be fair, early European observers often framed indigenous polities in terms that suited empire-building narratives. Their accounts are valuable but partial and biased. Archaeology allows us to measure earthworks and to read seafaring capabilities in the grid of canals, but it does not hand us the Calusa's political minutes. Competing theories about Mound Key probe the scale and nature of Calusa power. Some scholars see an essentially centralized, elite-run chiefdom with redistribution and tribute, while others argue for a more networked leadership where power worked through alliance, ritual prestige, and control of resources rather than through monopolized coercion. Both ideas have traction. The long-term accumulation of shells shows coordinated labor, so someone organized efforts. But whether that someone ruled with absolute commands or with ritual authority remains open. We still don't know how the Calusa articulated sovereignty in everyday life, what it cost to be a ruler, how succession worked, and how ritual labor was mobilized over generations. Picture standing on a shell ramp looking across a lagoon of mangrove islands where canoes cut silver scars into the water. Imagine the pageantry that must have surrounded leadership here, and hold your skepticism with the wonder of that scene. From Mound Key's shell-built islands we will cross inland, into the low, watery country of the Everglades and Lake Okeechobee Basin, to the Belle Glade and Fort Center landscapes, places of monumental earthworks not of shell but of ridges, mounds, and massive geometric earthworks that rework a watery plain into a monumental tableau. The fast tease. The Belle Glade monumental landscape rewrites our assumptions about sedentism and monumentality in a wetland world where seasonal flooding dictated life. Archaeological evidence for the Belle Glade culture spans a long range, often framed from roughly 1000 BC through contact times, with complex earthworks including linear ridges, circular enclosures, and platform mounds that controlled drainage, access, and ritual space. Sites like Fort Center, once controversial in interpretation but now recognized as long-lived centers of constructed space, show that people in the marsh could marshal engineering to create persistent places of social life. These communities built causeways and planted mounds and used tree islands as habitations and loci of ceremonial performance, strategies for living well in a landscape that alternated between marsh and dry season. Fort Center, in particular, challenges expectations. Excavations and remote sensing work revealed curving embankments, ponds, and platform mounds with evidence of human modification going back thousands of years. Scholars argue over the functions of these features: hydraulic management, ceremonial architecture, or a mixture of both, but the site's longevity and repetitive modification point to a social logic that lasted centuries. Some interpret the linear earthworks as practical corridors to keep people and materials moving through the wetland during high water. Others read symbolic intent into the shapes, suggesting processional ways or cosmological mapping in the landscape geometry. Now, let's be fair, disentangling utility from symbolism is notoriously hard. Engineers can build canals with ceremony in mind, and ritual may be embedded in everyday technologies. The Belle Glade monuments force us to expand our definition of monumental architecture. Stones and columns are not the only ways to make a statement. In flooded plains, deliberate ridge building and causewaying were as powerful as a stone wall in signaling permanence and shared purpose. We still don't know the precise social rules that bound these communities across season and year, nor the names they used for the channels and mounds that shaped their lives. Picture walking along a raised ridge between marshy ponds at dusk. You hear the slap of fish, the rustle of sawgrass, and you sense that every footfall was both practical passage and part of a long choreography of place. From inland marshes we circle back toward brackish lenses and sinkholes, to Little Salt Spring, a place that, like Windover, locked people into oxygen-poor water and preserved organic materials and human remains in uncanny detail. The one-line tease. Little Salt Spring is a deep sinkhole where waterlogged preservation captured early human activity and even megafauna, giving the region a rare chronological depth that includes both human burials and Pleistocene fossils. Excavations and underwater surveys have documented human remains and artifacts dating broadly to the Middle Archaic. Radiocarbon dates in the range of roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years before present for human burials, and some older Pleistocene contexts with dates stretching back beyond 12,000 years for extinct megafauna found in association with human-modified materials. That extraordinary temporal range makes Little Salt Spring both an archaeological and paleontological treasure. It opens questions about how early peoples used sinkholes, what ritual meanings they attach to these deep, still waters, and how human and animal histories intersected in the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. The spring preserves scenes that are hauntingly intimate: burned stakes and wooden implements last used in the water, intentional depositions of shells and bones, and human remains with preserved soft tissue in some cases. Those finds suggest mortuary practices that involve the sinkhole itself, perhaps offerings, perhaps funerary deposition, and they raise wider debates about early human behavior in Florida. The older Pleistocene bones and the evidence of fire and butchery on extinct tortoise remains force a re-examination of human megafauna interactions in the southeast. Did early people regularly exploit giant tortoises and other large animals? And what role did those animals play in early diets and cosmologies? Some of the dates associated with such finds are contested. Radiocarbon on charcoal and wood can be contaminated or misassigned, but the overall picture is a deep-time palimpsest that links human ritual, subsistence strategies, and environment across millennia. Now, let's be fair, the spring's sediments are complex, and not all purported associations are watertight. Careful stratigraphic work and repeated radiocarbon vetting are required. Still, Little Salt Spring's deep anoxic waters preserved an archive we rarely get to read intact, so its continued study is essential for understanding early Florida lifeways. We still don't know the full range of how these sinkholes fit into broader social networks. Were they local mortuary focuses, or part of long-distance ritual circuits visited at specific times? Picture lowering yourself into the spring's rim at dawn, watching the glassy water and imagining a lit torch reflecting off a paddler's skin as offerings sink to the dark below. To the west, on archaic shoreline terraces, is Horr's Island, a place where shell rings and monumental mounds stand as some of the earliest evidence of complex sedentism in Florida. Teasing the place down to a single sentence, Horr's Island's shell ring and constructed mounds date to the late Archaic and indicate early, organized community labor and ritual space in a coastal setting. Radiocarbon dates from Horr's Island push some mound components to more than 4,000 years before present, making them among the oldest mound burials in eastern North America. The site's horseshoe-shaped shell ring and associated platform mounds were substantial, middens reaching several meters in height, ring-shaped deposits surrounding a central plaza, suggesting planned communal architecture and possibly a ceremonial core. Those shapes echo shell rings elsewhere in the southeastern U.S., and their association with mounds here gives Horr's Island a special place in debates about how coastal peoples organized communal life in the Archaic. The shell ring's construction required coordinated labor and implies a negotiated social order. Hundreds of post holes found in excavations indicate circular buildings or structures, and the patterned accumulation of shells shows episodes of deposit that may reflect feasting, ritual deposition, or seasonal habitation. Some scholars see shell rings as evidence of emerging sedentism, groups returning to the same places to fish, process shellfish, and stage communal events, while others argue that they represent ephemeral feasting arenas tied to oyster seasonality. Either way, Horr's Island demonstrates that monumental behavior in hunter-gatherer contexts is not anomalous. People who lived mainly off the sea could still organize large-scale communal projects with social investment in placemaking. Yet interpretive debates remain. Were the mounds primarily burial places, elite platforms, or environmental engineering for raising living spaces above tidal flux? Each interpretation opens different narratives about social complexity in coastal prehistoric Florida. We still don't know exactly which combination of ritual, utility, and social signaling drove Horr's Island's builders, but standing on its ring, if you could imagine that circular plaza under a wide, clouded sky, you'd feel the human energy channeled into placing shell, sand, and bone until a landscape was remade. All these sites, Miami Circle, Mound Key, Crystal River, Key Marco, Windover, Little Salt Spring, Horr's Island, and the Belle Glade / Fort Center landscape, are individual faces of a single human motion, people making meaning from place, engineering landscapes, and preserving memory, sometimes by design and sometimes by accident of preservation. Yet despite the scale and ubiquity of those gestures, each holds stubborn unknowns about why particular practices took root and how social worlds were organized. Archaeology provides dates, measurements, material culture, and models, but it can rarely return the words people used or the melodies of their rites. That absence, curiously, is not failure but the prompt for curiosity. When we assemble radiocarbon dates into timelines, map midden volumes across shoreline transects, and read isotopes for diet and mobility, we add strokes to a collective portrait. But like any good portrait, much of the subject's interior life resists capture. So what do these mysteries, taken together, ask of us? They ask for a broader humility about what counts as complexity, and for an appreciation of varied pathways towards social elaboration. In Florida, the old evolutionary tracks: farmers make food surpluses, surpluses make elites, elites make monuments, are incomplete. Here, abundance from the sea and marsh gave rise to specialization and monumental expression without large-scale agriculture. Here, watery landscapes invited engineering on terms other than stone. Here, preservation in anoxic ponds and springs returned soft tissue and wood that elsewhere vanished. Those empirical twists should change how we teach prehistory. Complexity is not a single ladder but a branching river, and Florida's sites are tributaries that fed divergent human solutions to living richly in challenging ecologies. There is also a moral and civic question bound into these sites. Whose pasts do we privilege, and who decides how ancient people are remembered today? The Miami Circle's modern preservation fight, debates over artifact stewardship at Key Marco, and the involvement of descendant groups in managing mound sites make clear that archaeology is not a purely academic exercise. It is practiced with social consequences. Museums, parks, and city governments are custodians of places that carry contemporary meanings to living communities. The ethical turn in archaeology, toward consultation, repatriation, and community-centered interpretation, is the right answer to a long history of extraction. When scientists return fragments and the public visits an interpretive trail, both acts are forms of modern ritual, remembering together, deciding how to tell the stories, and placing new meaning on old places. One more practical and scientific point matters. Technology keeps changing the nature of these mysteries. Non-invasive remote sensing, ancient DNA, refined isotopic analyses, and better conservation methods are like new lights in a cave. They can show features invisible to older tools, connect people across distances with genetic threads, and recover pigment traces on driftwood masks that were once just brown shapes. But technology is not magic. It narrows some questions even as it opens others. Ancient DNA can suggest relationships and migration probabilities, yet it rarely names the exact social practices that shape those patterns. Remote sensing can show buried canals and causeways, but fieldwork and context still teach us how people use them. So we must keep method and imagination together, skepticism with wonder, precision with provision for mighty human imagination. In the final accounting, these places teach us about the human cost and the human gift of placemaking. They show that people will invest labor, art, and ritual into the landscape whether their world is built of stone, shell, peat, or sand. A carved feline from a muddy pond, a bedrock ring under a city, a shell island palace, each is evidence of intentionality across time. Yet they also insist that the archaeological record is fragmentary and partial. Each new technique loosens knots and tucks in new threads. Each ethical conversation recenters voices who have claims to these pasts. That combination, science pushing forward while communities insist on respect, is the healthiest path for the next generation of discoveries. So as we close this chapter of our cinematic tour, picture once more what we've walked, fog lifting from a peat pond where dead were wrapped in woven fibers, the delicate gaze of a carved Key Marco cat held above a brackish channel, the raised shell ramps of Mound Key with canoes threading in, the cleared, plastered plaza at Crystal River where copper glinted in a burial, the bedrock ribs of the Miami Circle under the shadow of modern glass, the deep anoxic blue of Little Salt Spring holding traces of humans and megafauna across epochs, and the horseshoe shell ring of Horr's Island where people staged their communal life. Each place hums with material evidence and with unanswered questions. Together they change us a little. They widen our sense of human possibility, complicate tidy origin stories, and remind us that the past is not a single, closed book but a library still partly uncatalogued. And finally, an invitation: keep looking, not to close the book with a tidy final chapter, but to keep the conversation honest. Go to the mounds and stand on their crowns. Read interpretive panels that are the best stories we can tell today. Listen to descendant communities who help us understand what should be protected and how. Support careful archaeology that works with local voices. Favor conservation over spectacle. And when you encounter a claim about giants or lost continents, ask for the data. The mysteries are most rewarding when approached with both wonder and scrutiny. Keep digging, some secrets still lie just beneath your feet.